I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold there grew. Of wind I sang, a wind there came, and in the branches blew. Beyond the sun, beyond the moon, the foam was on the sea, and by the strand of Ilmarinen there grew a golden tree.
Well, I sort of accidentally designed a dress. Contemplating an idea of creating a autumn-inspired dress, I was not at all expecting it to look like anything like this, but I was looking through fabric and I happened to see this orange fabric that is actually a curtain, and I have two of these curtain pieces, and I got these at a thrift store probably over 5 years ago, and I had no inspiration for them because they're more of a hardier fabric, almost more of a work type fabric. So I kind of just shied away from it because I didn't know what it could ever be. But I saw it in there, I started draping, and within 5 minutes I had this design. So I am going with it. I am just gonna do it. It'll be basically replicated, that design, on the second side. For the sleeves, I am going to pull in another piece of fabric because I don't have enough of the orange fabric to make big sleeves, but I want big sleeves because that just would look really nice, right? And I think I'm kind of going a little elven type inspiration for this. Think Hobbit elves, not like Christmas elves, but Hobbit elves, and kind of that really like flowy autumn elf thing. Anyway, I've got a red and I've got this yellow piece of fabric. So I don't know what I'm gonna do yet. Who knows? I'm just going to play around with it, and then I pulled out a piece of lace, and I think I'm going to incorporate this almost like insertion, but then I might do something creative with like pulling this across and then gathering up the back. But yeah, it's just like a rectangle piece of fabric that I've draped on the bias here, put some pleats in, pulled up the skirt, back's kind of gathered, and that's all I've got for now. But I'm just gonna start playing around with the lace and cutting the hole for the sleeve and see where we get.
When cutting out the armhole, I also sort of slid it down towards the back. This is so I can arrange the back pleats the way I'm envisioning it should be. So we'll get to that in just a minute. When playing with this fabric, I really wanted to capitalize on the fact that it's a curtain and it's already hemmed on all four sides, and so I tried my best to use as much of that hem as possible. In the end, I didn't have to do any finishing of edges except at the armhole. In order to replicate the darts on the second side, I'm first marking them on this draped piece of fabric, and now I can transfer them to the second one. Here you can see how the armhole wraps around the back and holds the pleats in. The only cut made in this dress is the armhole, and then I did actually have to chop off a corner of the rectangle that falls at the hem because I guess I snatched a bit of fabric from one of the curtain panels a while back, I don't know when, and also I just forgot about it and never hemmed it, so... And now to pin up the darts. And then to sew the darts. I decided to not go the conventional route, and I just thought I'd try out a decorative way of doing this sewing of the darts. Using the catch stitch, which I can actually call a herringbone stitch this time, because when a catch stitch is decorative, you call it a herringbone stitch. For this stitch, you actually work in the opposite direction, so left to right, and in this case, it's a stitch in the folded edge of the dart, and then one right up close to where that folded edge is laying, and like this all the way down the dart. For the edge of the armhole, because it needs to be finished, I'm sewing a piece of cotton tape right along the raw edge. Then this edge is folded over, and I'm doing a top stitch about an 1/8 inch away from the edge. This stitch will be covered up by the lace, so that's why I'm just using a white thread, and because I'm lazy. The edge of the tape still is a little bit loose in there, so I just did a quick cat stitch to secure that edge down. Now the lace is placed along the edge, aligning that one edge to that white sewing line. This lace is then hand stitched down with small stitches. Once both halves of this overdress is finished and sewn together, it's time to attach them both together. And I just chose to align the front edges and use the herringbone stitch to secure them together. And because this area will have a lot of tension on it, and also there's a chance that the stitches could separate and show what's underneath, I went to the back side and secured those edges with just a simple whip stitch. With the back pleats, I'm getting them sewn up with just some machine stitches because the fabric from the armhole will cover up those stitches. And then it just took some playing around with the placements of the pleats compared to the top piece together, and once the sweet spot was found, I just did some hand sewing. To finish this area off, I need to somehow connect the two edges together with clasps or something of some sort. But I really didn't want to go the hooks and eyes or dress clasp way because one, I was just a little bit lazy and didn't want to figure that out, but also you just sometimes don't want to do the same connections over and over and over again. So I decided to put a grommet in each side and use a ribbon or piece of lace to tie the two edges together. And the last thing on this overdress is to pull up the side sweeps and secure them in some way. I wanted them to be removable or undone, so I didn't want a permanent connection between the two. So I decided to go with buttons and loops. I'm putting buttons on both sides of the fabric. So this is to help save the fabric underneath. When you have a button on top and the thread is sewing the button on, you have a lot of stress on that fabric that has the stitches going through it and pulling on that button. And whenever that button is pulled on, it's pulling on that fabric. So when you put a second button underneath the first button, with the fabric sandwiched in between, the thread is now pulling on that second button instead of the fabric. For the loop, which will be placed on the lower section of the skirt and then pulled up to loop on that upper button, I am just making a loop out of some string. I took a string and divided its strands just a bit. I'm feeding this section of string into a large needle and just basically putting a loop in the fabric. And at the back side of the loop, I'm also putting a button to again save the fabric. And now we can move on to the underdress. So you remember that red and yellow fabric I was debating about at the beginning of this video? Well, the verdict was neither. I didn't like the idea of using both, and there wasn't enough fabric of one or the other to make the full underdress. And after my mom and I were pulling fabrics from my stash for what seemed like a very long time, there was just nothing that really would work. And I really didn't want to go out and buy more, so I pulled some white cotton wool out of the stash and dyed it. And I don't have many dye colors, but the one that might work was called terracotta, and I had no idea if it would actually be the right color. I just wung it and hoped it'd work. And as it turns out, it was the perfect color. As for the design of this underdress, I just sort of played around with the fabric and went with the flow of my hands. Sometimes that just happens. My hands do something with the fabric, and then I have to use my mind to figure out what's happening and if it will actually work. Anyway, you might have noticed that the salvage edge is being used for the neckline, and also the straps have one edge that is the salvage. Again, trying to minimize hemming, but also I really like how that salvage edge dyed sort of brought a bright look to this underdress. As for the pattern, what I came up with was 2 pieces over the bust, and each of those pieces have long ties that will crisscross and wrap around to the back. Then there's a front skirt panel and a side panel, and at the back we've got 2 pieces that cross over each other, and after it's been crossed over, the middle seam is sewn down to the hem. And off the sides of these 2 back pieces, I've left long ties that will cross over the front, over the shoulder, and tie at the back. For all these seams sewing this underdress together, I am doing a small French seam. And while I was doing this, a cute little niece named Willa came a-visiting. The front sections of the bodice is pleated slightly, as well as the back. This pleat area is where the crisscross is going to happen. These pleats are then kept together with some small, invisible as possible, hand stitches. And then along the straps, there's a lot of rolled hems to do to secure those raw edges and keep them from fraying and all that. As for the sleeves, I forgot to film a lot of the process because I was kind of stumped on what I was going to do, and I just decided on a slimmer upper section and a nice full lower one. And then of course the bottom edge of those flowy sleeves are hand sewn with a rolled hem. And last but definitely not least, there's the full hem of the underdress to sew up. I decided to hand sew it because why not?
you have it, making this elven autumn dress. It turned out pretty well. It's kind of weird when I first started it. I really didn't know what it was gonna look like, how it was gonna turn out. It was kind of just play with fabric and some lace and see what happens. And then the underdress, I had an idea with that original red fabric, but it just there wasn't enough there to make like big sleeves, a nice full skirt, and so I ended up dyeing it, and it came out such a good color to match this overdress. And I just love this fabric in general. It's just so light and flowy and pretty. But I ended up making the underdress much prettier than I was originally planning as far as what would be visible. So you only see a little bit in the front and then in the back, and then of course the sleeves and a little bit of the skirt. But overall, this underdress I think needs to be turned into an actual dress. So I need to make an underdress for the underdress so that the underdress can be an outer dress. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this little autumn-inspired project and maybe inspired you to go design something for yourself. And as always, a huge thank you to my patrons, especially during this time where I have not posted very many videos, and also to all of you, I am so sorry for that. It's just I needed a break, but also just didn't know where to go next with this channel. But I think I have a good idea in the next few months, and I have a lot of projects planned for those coming months. And also just a quick tidbit for those of you who are following along, my work dress Cinderella dress, that is still in the works, but it's going to be kind of postponed and not be finished probably till end of winter, just because I'm gonna take my time making this one. So anyway, thanks for watching, and go out there and learn, create, and inspire.